Hello, I'm Jake Stone,
I'm Jesse Owens.
and we welcome you to another episode of Generally Particular, a production of the London Lyceum. Generally Particular is a show dedicated to discussing and reflecting on the whole Baptist story. We are a show by Baptists, about Baptists, and for Baptists, as well as Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterian, and Lutherans. We also hope to show some light to the Seventh-day Adventists and Foursquare Gospel advocates. I'm a Calvinist Baptist. Jesse is an Arminian Baptist. In the 17th and 18th centuries, we would have been known as a particular Baptist and a general Baptist. And so we've put those together in what we think is a fun show to talk about Baptist history, generally particular. Today is a special day for us because we are going to be discussing a monumental event in recent Baptist history. Our show is dedicated to thinking and reflecting upon the 30th anniversary of Dr. Albert Mohler's inaugural convocation address at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, entitled, Don't Just Do Something, Stand There. And so today we are thinking about this address. And as anyone who has paid attention to the London Lyceum knows that in the past there's been talk of a Jake Stone bingo sheet. And one of those squares is entitled 1993 Al Mohler. And so today we get to talk about one of my favorite subjects. Jesse, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Jake, and I thank you for bringing me along for the ride while you talk about Al Mohler's 1993 Convocation Address. Don't just do something, stand there. So I'm going to sit here and watch, and I'm looking forward to what you do here.
Well, we know that when it comes to talking about confessionalism, you have very little to say on that subject that's positive. So, no, so when this episode releases, it will release on August the 31st, which is the 30th anniversary of this convocation address. Now, I encourage people, you can go on Southern's website on YouTube and you can actually watch Dr. Mohler deliver this. And I think that when you watch him deliver it, you need to remember that in the audience that day, besides his wife and children, David Dockery, and maybe 5 more people in there, they weren't really buying what he was saying that day. He definitely was a man walking into the arena as almost as if he were the away team because he did not have that much support at the beginning.
I want to know what those people in the robes back in the seminary choir were thinking. That's what I want to know.
Well, I know from a good friend of mine who was here at Southern in the early 2000s in the music program that he told me that the music program 10 years into Dr. Mohler's time was where the last holdout of the liberals were here. So you can best believe probably the choir folk back there, they weren't embracing it either. So
Yeah.
They were not singing. They were singing "I'll Fly Away" as if they wanted to fly away and get out of there. So, but let's talk about this for a moment, Jesse. I mean, you're a graduate of Southern, and I'm a current student here. And as we think about the history of the institution, Dr. Mohler's inaugural convocation address here in 1993 was really a call for the institution to recover its roots and its heritage. This is, I would argue and contend, I still believe this. This is the best modern defense of confessionalism by a Baptist. Because really what Dr. Mohler does here is he goes back to the beginning of the charter of the school, James Pettigrew Boyce's 3 Changes in Theological Institutions, which was an address he gave when he became a professor at Furman 3 years before the seminary starts. And in that address, Boyce is really defending confessionalism. And so Mohler is going back to the beginning. This institution, you can make arguments 50 to 90 years before 1993 had moved more and more and more away from that confessional foundation. And so he's coming in, and buddy, it's like a whole different tune. 9 years before this address is when Roy Honeycutt gives his 84 convocation, "To your tents, O Israel," which was the battle cry of the moderates in the SBC to wage war. So in less than a decade, you go from that to standing up here and saying, folks, we're Baptists. That means we're confessionalists. We need to get back to it. It's a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very big difference. And listening back through this and then kind of reading back through it, it's amazing the way that he not only talks about the way in which the institution is founded upon the abstracted principles, so calling the institution, the professors back to the doctrine that's taught there, but the way in which he delineates some of the key doctrines in the abstracted principles. So he doesn't just talk about it in a vague sort of way. He actually goes through some of those doctrines, which I'm sure many there would have found offensive to their sentiments. I love though his approach again is not to say, hey, we're going to go back and follow the confession, we're going to follow the abstract, and we're not going to take theological research or inquiry seriously. I think what he does is very much in the spirit of what the London Lyceum is doing, in that he's saying, let's give serious thought to these things. Let's be rigorous in our theology and in our study. But at the end of the day, I mean, we are bound to this confession. It's a contract between faculty and institution, between faculty and student. This is what guides us. This is what we should expect in the classroom, and not our private interpretation of it, but in the sense that it was intended by the people who wrote it.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that Dr. Mohler does when he kind of lays out some of the background of Boyce and the influences on him, and he's very conscious, Dr. Mohler is, of who influenced Boyce and one of the other founders, Basil Manley Jr. Both of them went to Princeton. And Dr. Mohler cites here Samuel Miller, who was a longtime professor at Princeton, who wrote about the usage of creeds and the importance of subscription. And so that's really where you see, and you and I think, have talked about this before, but in the 19th century, you could already see Baptists in the North beginning to shrink back some from confessional subscription. I'm very grateful and think that Francis Whalen is one of the most important Baptists of the 19th century. But if you read some of his comments on confessions, you can see in his life already a little bit of a development of loosening confessional subscription among Baptists in the North. Whereas what happens with Boyce and Manley, that tradition, known as the Charleston tradition in the South, Princeton exemplifies that as a confessional Presbyterian institution. And so bringing that back down, Boyce is really saying, if we're going to have a Baptist institution, it must be confessional. And I'll tell anyone this, you can have, there's many things that we can critique as far as social moral issues with the founders of Southern, that's obvious. But when it comes to the institution and their visionary leadership, if Boyce had not insisted the charter have confessional subscription, you and I would never have came to Southern Seminary, because there would have been no way possible to recover this institution, because that was in the foundation. And there had been presidents and faculty who ignored it and forsook it. But Dr. Mohler came back and reclaimed it. If that had not been in the charter, if that had not been in the foundation, recovery would not have happened. And I think that shows why, by the point that Boyce is here, there had been Baptists who had assumed things and they were forgotten. He realized we can't assume it. We have to codify it. It's got to be there in print, on paper, down in the foundation. And that's what really enabled Dr. Mohler to be able to come here and go back to that vision.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, though, people are subscribing to that confession for a period of time and not really affirming again this sense that the original authors of it intended. So, this kind of reminds me of some of my interest in research in the 18th century, where people are subscribing to the 39 Articles or to the Westminster Confession of Faith or other confessions of faith, and they know what's intended by those confessions, but they're kind of affirming them in accordance with their own private interpretation of those. So part of the background that Mohler is doing with the founders is not merely just saying that they come from a confessional background, but also giving something of the origins of their sense of what they mean by those. And therefore, when faculty subscribe to the abstractive principles, the sense of the text that they ought to be affirming as well. So, it's possible to subscribe to a text, to affirm a text in your own sort of private interpretation. And so that's one of the things he's saying. Not only let's go back to being confessional, but what is the sense? What is the meaning of the abstractive principles, which is equally important.
Yeah, and that's the key. That there had become a point in time in the history of this institution where people's private interpretation of the confession is how they signed it. And that was
Yeah, yeah,
explicitly contrary to what the contract says and what the charter said. The charter said you can't sign this with mental reservations or somehow your own kind of private thing. And when you read the history of the institution, there were many professors who were hired. That's essentially how they were hired. And that's why they could go up there and sign it and never thought about the document ever again. And it goes back to the importance of, you can say subscription, but it must be enforced. And that's why Dr. Mohler became very unpopular, but he was doing his job, because it was confessional subscription, confessional accountability. Therefore, you enforce the confession, and if you're teaching outside and contrary to it, then you had to be terminated.
yeah. I also, like you were saying when we first started, imagine the courage it would take thinking about the people in that audience, the faculty in that
Yeah.
audience, the students who had been under their teaching. That is a very unfriendly environment. So there might have been other people who had, held Dr. Mulder's views on things, but maybe they either hadn't been placed in a position of authority, or maybe they just didn't have the courage to take the step that he took. So not merely the conviction that this is the abstract and that it needs to be enforced, but to actually implement that. That takes incredible courage.
Yeah. And the abstract itself was a summary of the Charleston Confession, which was the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. And it's very interesting. Dr. Mohler walks through Boyce's reflection on the writing of the document, that the aim of the abstract was to represent the truths that Southern Baptists all agreed on, whether that's dealing with Trinitarian issues, soteriology, ecclesiology, and so forth. And I love this, and I think that if we could try to, we started off this podcast series, our recordings this way, but he says that the abstract remains a powerful testimony to a Baptist theological heritage that is genuinely evangelical, reformed, biblical, and orthodox. And here's the part of me, as I sit and listen or read this, when he's saying these things, when was the last time anyone uttered these words inside that building? I mean, who's the last person that was up there in chapel talking about that we're Reformed and Orthodox Baptist? I mean, I can't, I can't think of anybody.
Yeah,
Um,
probably not. I think that we need to probably say, and I think this has been implied up to this point, but the natural inclination of institutions, and probably even of churches, but certainly institutions of higher education, as we think about academics and studying and the production of academic materials, is probably not towards orthodoxy, but maybe is towards at least novelty and maybe eventually heterodoxy. And so one of the
There was a lot of
important
that happening at Southern.
yeah. Well, and honestly, I mean, this is people become dissatisfied with sort of affirming orthodoxy. It maybe it feels like repristination, like we're just repeating the people who came before us. And who wants to do that? So then the inclination is towards novelty. And I would say, there is a danger when we think about history and historical theology that it's sort of the dead faith of the living, to use a well known phrase. So we have to be careful about that, and we're not just after repristination, but there also has to be a sense in which we are satisfied on matters of orthodoxy with affirming the truths of that those who have come before us have affirmed, that we're not so given over to novelty and to new things that we feel like we have to come up with new and novel doctrines. We're satisfied to speak in accordance with those who have come before us. And academics really struggle with that. And just really the nature of the academy and of academic publishing and all of those sorts of things is this desire and push to be coming up with new and novel interpretations of things. You have to do something different than the scholars who wrote on this before you. So that's always a danger. And so it's extremely important for theological institutions, certainly those who are charged with training ministers, which Southern Seminary is and was, and what Dr. Mohler is affirming, that we be guided by confessions of faith, so that with this natural drift and this natural tendency towards novelty, we can constantly be reforming, constantly being brought back to confessional orthodoxy.
On that, and I think that the very testimony of this school, the way that Boyce and Broadus dealt with Crawford Toy was very, I think people sometimes lose sight of this, was very unpopular and divisive in SBC life. I mean, Crawford Toy was a golden boy academic in Southern Baptist, the Southern Baptist world. And for Boyce and Broadus, and some, I think I could make an argument that they may have waited too long in some ways before they acted, but nevertheless, they did act. And when they did that, they got a lot of critique, but time proved in short order that they had made the right call, because the trajectory Toy was on, they could see it and where it ended up leading.
Yeah. I think sometimes, by the way, people forget how early Baptists were influenced by Protestant liberalism. If you look at some of the earliest Protestant liberals, even in the 19th century, going into the 20th century, some of the earliest people to embrace higher criticism and Protestant liberalism were Baptists. Yeah. You see it in a variety of places. You see the effect that it had on Crawford Toy and his training, but you also see it in other figures and in the University of Chicago, in a variety of figures. Baptists embrace Protestant liberalism pretty early on, and it kind of trickles down eventually, I think, to Southern Seminary, even certainly by the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. But early on, Baptists were very influenced by modernism and by Protestant liberalism.
So let's think of some. These are some statements that Dr. Mohler makes in his address that I think are very good, and they're just as timely today as they were 30 years ago, which is why I think this is such a I would argue it's one of the best things Dr. Mohler's ever written. And I've people have heard me say this over and over, and that's why we're doing this show on this. Is I really think it's good for people once a year to go back and either listen or read over this. But he says, what do we see these men articulating by writing a confession and making it authoritative? And he said, first, that truth is always confronted with error, and that the doctrinal depository of the church is ever in danger of compromise. the founders of this institution were quite ready to speak of orthodoxy and heterodoxy, of evangelical truth and heresy. This was a vocabulary used with individuals certain of the reality of divine revelation and the necessity of orthodox teaching. These issues were taken with deadly seriousness. They offered no apology for stipulating doctrinal issues nor for demanding theological fidelity. And while it preceded a few years of the common refrain now that people have of my truth and your truth, those sentiments lived here in what was taught. And what Mohler is saying here and what the founders said, no, there is the truth and there is error. Those are real categories. There is real conformity and real deviation. And so that's why this went over not very well with these people up here, because there were a lot of them who were teaching, you throw out these notions of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy, that's some Puritan barbarism almost. And it's about what you feel and what you experience. And, you can't let anybody tell you that you can't believe A, B, or C. Well, as it said, we're dealing with matters of eternity here. This isn't just, this isn't like picking out which shade of curtains you want. This is about the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I love the paragraph a little bit later where he says about modernity. He says, it cannot be so here, not because we are unaware of the currents of modern knowledge, not because we do not understand the challenges of a revivalistic and secular age, where all issues of truth and meaning are automatically privatized and politicized, not because we're unaware of the hermeneutics of suspicion, but precisely because we have faith in God and in his truth unchanged and unchanging. To our motive is not to seek false refuge in an antiquarian past, absolved of its faults and blemishes, but to keep the faith once for all delivered to the saints. And then I love this. We fear no charges of foundationalism, positivism, or authoritarianism. We do fear God and his divine judgment. So essentially he's saying,
that'll preach.
Amen. To be orthodox is not to be ignorant, right? It's not to not be aware of the currents of modernism and the rejection of orthodoxy. So when we think about theological education and when we think about conservative orthodox theological education, Mohler is very clear. We want to expose students to the most cutting edge research that's out there. We're not burying our heads in the sand. But at the same time, we're not giving in to the influence of those trends in order to reject orthodoxy. The goal is not to be novel. It's not to be accepted. It's to engage critical ideas. But really, that truth is unchanged, and as he says, unchanging. And I love that thought of academic rigor, but realizing the necessity of the guardrails in many senses of orthodoxy.
Yeah, and he talks about in the formation of the confession, that you have to have this to protect, that it is, and he cites Boyce here, it's not an infringement on the rights of men, and that they sign and say, I will teach according to this. And he talks about, and I think one of the things that I like about this address is that the reason that Boyce and his contemporaries were doing these things is they were seeing what was happening around them. Already, great institutions founded by the Puritans had become Unitarian. Yeah. And the specter of the Campbellite movement and Alexander Campbell and no creed but Christ, Boyce makes the statement, it is with a single man that error usually commences. And then Dr. Mohler talks about the doctrinal deviations that were happening in that day. And he says this: they knew nothing of radical revisionist theologies which would follow, of process philosophy and deconstructionism or demythologization and logical positivism. And those are some big words that I can't pronounce. But They knew the pattern of compromise and deviation which marked the checkered history of the church and its testimony to the truth. They had seen the radical enlightenment and the
Yeah.
French Revolution, and they had seen enough to understand the challenge. And so
Yeah.
that's why we're in a place today where we see even more of these things. So, how in the world can we say we need less confessional and creedal accountability and teaching? I mean, we need it even more now than they did in 1993 in some respects.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly, and I think this is to the credit of Boyce and Broadus and others. I mean, you see a significant deviation on historic Christian orthodoxy in the 1700s. I mean, even in the American context, Thomas Paine, in a popular patriotic writer, publishes *The Age of Reason* in like 1794. And in that, he's rejecting the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch and all sorts of things. That's in the 1790s, and it's preceded by in the English context and in the European context by many decades prior to that. So certainly by the time we're getting to the mid 19th century, to the 1840s, 1850s, obviously by then people who are familiar with the European context and of academic circles in the American context would have already seen significant developments towards heterodoxy. And so while it might seem to some of us a bit strange that they would have been so cautious and so concerned in the mid 19th century, maybe we view that as some sacred Orthodox time. They had seen, like Mohler says, they had seen enough.
Yeah.
They had already seen enough.
And Jesse, tell our audience, who is the great Baptist who engaged with Thomas Paine's work?
Um, oh, by the way, I initially think about Elias Boudinot. That's who I initially think of. Who are you thinking of?
Andrew Fuller.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
right.
Fuller engages Paine's work with some depth because it was not just popular in America, but in England as well.
Yeah.
So,
Andrew Fuller.
well, Dr. Nettles would be doing that at Jesse for not remembering. So,
yeah, I've read the 3 volumes of the Sprinkle edition, but I have to admit it's been about 10 years now, so it's been a
it's
while.
time for some Fuller retrieval. It sounds like for Jesse.
It is. The London Lyceum ought to do some Fuller retrieval. Just saying.
I share those sentiments.
Dropping those Easter eggs.
Yeah. So then we get towards the end of the address, and let me just make a statement here. During the course of the address, a good bit of it is actually Dr. Mohler giving a summary of every article. And again, I think that would have been the most theological and orthodox content that had been in that place in a long time. And so, he really works through what the doctrine is. And we've got to understand too, this address is speaking to the faculty there of this is how he's going to lead this institution. A new day has dawned at Southern, and it's really the old day. It's the old paths. I mean, Dr. Mohler doesn't use that phrase in this address, but that's what he was calling them to go back to. But he's also speaking to the denomination. And while this is specifically geared towards the SBC, I think this speaks to the broader Baptist world, and we could even say, Christian world. But he says this, he says, we have arrived at a critical moment for the Southern Baptist Convention and its churches. A denomination once marked by intense theological commitment and a demonstrable theological consensus has seen that doctrinal unity pass into a programmatic consciousness. We are in danger of losing our theological grammar, and more seriously by far, of forfeiting our theological inheritance. This crisis far outweighs the controversy which has marked the Southern Baptist Convention for the last 14 years, which people call the conservative resurgence, some call it the fundamentalist takeover, known as the battle for the Bible. That controversy is a symptom rather than the root cause, which I think a lot of even conservative resurgence leaders often failed to grasp. As Southern Baptists, we are in danger of becoming God's most unembarrassed pragmatist, much more enamored with statistics than invested in theological substance. And my question is really 30 years later, I think this is just, if not even more applicable to our moment right now. What do you say?
Yeah,
Or are you
I mean,
post-millennial and think it's all gotten better?
no, I mean, I thought, it's safer, like you said in the last episode, if we just leave it all in the past. It gets a little more dangerous when you bring it into
I
the
know, but
present.
it's fun too.
Well, so let's frame it this way, and you can tell me. I'll frame it this way, and you can tell me if you agree. A lot of times, I hear people say about when we're thinking about American culture and American society, that when we talk about theological doctrine, when we think about doctrine, we think about truth, but especially when we're thinking about theological categories and we're trying to think seriously about doctrine in a confessional orthodox sort of way, the response that I get sometimes is kind of like the Titanic is sinking. Can't you see that the Titanic is sinking? And the type of thing you're commending is like polishing brass on a sinking Titanic. Like, what's the purpose? Why are we wasting our time? What we need is just to throw people life preservers. We just need to get people saved and not worry ourselves so much with all of this nuanced doctrine. That's the response I get sometimes. But it's in a moment of theological crisis that Al Mohler is stepping into when he's delivering this on August 31st of 1993. And his response is not, let's have some sort of doctrinal minimalism, but what we need to rescue this institution and this denomination is not some sort of doctrinal minimalism and an agreement that we all affirm the Great Commission, but we need a reformation in accordance with the confession of faith, with the abstract of principles at this institution. And I think it's a reminder to us that moments of crisis shouldn't push us to some sort of doctrinal minimalism. It shouldn't lead us to say we need to just get to the sort of lowest common denominator, quit polishing the brass on the sinking Titanic. Stop talking about, the atonement, and stop talking about penal substitution. Cut that out. We don't have time for all of that. We need to see souls saved. We need to, raise X number of dollars for missions, and we need to do, and all of these things are fine and good, but what is the foundation for those things? What is the thing that undergirds those? What is our doctrinal agreement? And I think previous generations, some of them at least, some of them understood that better. But at the end of the day, I'm afraid, like Dr. Mohler says, without knowing it, we sort of we would say we're conservative evangelicals, but really on what basis? On what basis? What doctrinal basis? We kind of have just become pragmatists. So maybe at the end of the day we're evangelical, but what about the next generation? And I'm not so sure. I mean, I think with your assessment, your critique, maybe, yeah. I mean, I agree. I don't know that we're any better off now in many ways than we were then.
I think too, your comment about in crisis moments, if you think about in the history of Baptist life, I think it's fascinating for us to consider that our confessions and catechisms were written under great persecution. I mean,
Yeah.
we
No, things were pretty easy there in the 16 teens, and then 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. And when you had Charles II in the 1660s, things were pretty smooth. So they just had it really easy, and that's why they were, kind of kicking back and writing these confessions of faith, because things were going real smoothly for
no. It's in Hercules Collins writes an Orthodox Catechism. He's in jail.
them.
Um, our old friend John Bunyan, who's become quite a lightning rod here in the last couple of weeks, you know, whatever we want to call him, whether he was a Baptist or not, he was in prison. I mean, I think about, and you make that, think about this. Nehemiah Cox responding to the heresies of Thomas Collier in the
Hmm.
1670s is during a time when Baptists are having to meet in secret. They're meeting in secret, they're being persecuted, they're being jailed, and yet Cox takes the time, because he's asked by other brethren, to respond in detail to error and to heresy. And I think if we're going to have a bulwark, and if we're going to be able to navigate these waters, it's not going to be based off of TikTok and clickbait and whatever else little cliches that people come up with or that sounds great. And it's not going to be it's not going to be through memes. That's the problem. People think I own someone by a meme. You know, it's insanity. It's not by a meme that you do anything, but
That's
make
so
people
base,
like you
so
and that agree
basic.
with you laugh. All right.
Yeah.
So we need to be rigorous. And that's the thing that I think is when he's standing and saying this, he's not saying this to a friendly audience. And I think, if you want to see an instance of courage and of some backbone, it is in this address. He's not preaching to the choir here. The choir's against him,
Mm. Yeah.
literally and figuratively.
Literally.
And it's a call. This is the call to us, because we're still the siren songs of pragmatism still allure too many people.
Yeah. Sometimes I think the critique of people that are kind of like, "Hey, stop talking about all the confessionalism. Stop talking about systematic theology. Stop talking about all of that stuff. We want to see something done. We want to see some change." The critique, I think, from those people is that people who are concerned about confessional orthodoxy are just kind of interested in like navel gazing. We don't actually want to do anything. We just want to parse, these finer points. So I think we need to take that seriously. Are we just interested in navel gazing and parsing the finer points of doctrine, or is orthodox doctrine the foundation for practice? So, right, so orthodoxy leading to orthopraxy. But I think what Mohler is saying is, the emphasis seems to be on doing, but without any sort of orthodox foundation. So I think what we need to be saying is there is no doing apart from having this orthodox foundation. We need the foundation of orthodoxy, but to folks in our circles, we need to say, but we can't be satisfied with just having the foundation of orthodoxy. We need to press forward and actually do something in light of these beliefs. So we don't just want activity without orthodoxy, and we don't want orthodoxy without orthopraxy, without activity, but you do have to have the foundation in order to lead to the other. And we need both of those things. So I think we need to take seriously the critiques of people who are saying, you're not doing anything. But we need to respond by saying, what are we going to do? And unless we have this foundation of confessional orthodoxy, then what is it that we're agreeing to do? We have to have both of these things.
And to circle back real quick to something you said, people say, well, we just need to get them saved. You got to have doctrine for that. You got
Yeah.
to know why we need to be saved, how we are saved, why we are saved, and who
Yeah.
does the saving. And that
Yeah.
means that when Paul said, I determined to know nothing else but
Mm.
Jesus Christ and Him crucified, that was not just Him saying minimalism. It's the
Yeah.
simplicity of the preaching of the gospel. But when you're preaching Christ
Mm.
and Him crucified, you're preaching doctrine. You're preaching Him as prophet and priest and king. You're preaching Him as sacrifice. You're preaching His imputed righteousness. You are preaching that He is the way, the truth, and the life. So there's substance to that.
Amen. By the way, this reminds me of a really good. I'm going to throw our listeners for a bit of a loop here. There's a really good Adrian Rogers sermon on penal substitution. Just saying.
Let's just say that we all wish we could preach like Adrian Rogers with his voice.
I remember growing up hearing a lot of Adrian Rogers sermons. My dad listened to Adrian Rogers a lot. I probably have heard most of Adrian Rogers sermons, but I do remember thinking especially when I started preaching, if that's how you have to outline a text to be a preacher, I I am so doomed.
You don't just
I
alliterate
will
the
never
points,
come
you
up with this.
alliterate the subpoints, and you alliterate the
And the
subpoints, subpoints.
points. I know. That's why I listen to Alistair Begg, because I think I'm not going to be able to preach like Alistair Begg, but I listen to his sermon outlines and I'm like, I can come up with that though. I could do that.
Well, as we think about Dr. Mohler's 30th anniversary coming up, we are thankful to the Lord for him and being used by God and for this address. And we would call people today to come back and to understand Baptist confessionalism and why it matters in the church and institutions and in our lives. And so we finish off today telling people, don't just do something, stand there. And in the words of Jeremiah, stand there in the old paths, which is the Baptist way. So stay Baptist, my friend.